Thank you all so much for being here. I am Desen Özkan. I'm your program chair for LEES, Liberal Education Engineering Society this year. Very kind. I clicked a lot of buttons and I read a lot of emails, so I enjoyed getting to know folks. And I'm really excited and grateful for the team. Our division chair, Mary Stetler-Klein, big claps, who thinks that she's going to not be involved next year, but she doesn't quite know how much. Okay, all right. We've had an incredible team. We have had a lot of new folks. Carrie Zacharias is our division chair-elect, doing a lot of important kind of behind-the-scenes work. Sadly, she didn't make it this year. We've had an incredible team, a lot of new faces, and we're just really excited to kind of close out the day or the program with Dr. Stephanie Masta. So before I get into that, I am excited to kind of bring up Dr. Avneet Hira from Boston College to actually give a proper introduction. So thank you all.
I was told I have 5 to 10 minutes, so this might take 6 minutes and 20 seconds. That's how long it took in my hotel room last night. Hello, everyone. Thanks to Sen and the team. I was on the board this past year for the first time and I had a great time in LEES. If we're still looking for officers, everyone should join. Today, I'm here to introduce Dr. Stephanie Masta, who is a member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians and a professor of curriculum studies at Purdue University, where she's been on the faculty since 2014. She is the leading scholar on educational experiences of Indigenous students, drawing on Indigenous epistemologies to examine how cultural, political, and social forces shape the realities of schooling. Her articles have appeared in high-impact journals, including the Journal of Engineering Education, Teaching in Higher Education, and Anthropology and Education Quarterly. Additionally, she has secured substantial external funding from the National Science Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and the Spencer Foundation. Dr. Masta's contributions have been recognized, as they should be, through awards, including Purdue's Outstanding Faculty Graduate Mentoring Award, the Engineering Education Award for Excellence in Mentoring, and a Senior Scholar appointment at the Learning Institute for Visionary Epistemologies in STEM fields at UC Santa Barbara. Though we are way more than our bios, or someone said an anti-capitalist love poem is that you're way more than your productivity as well. So I will take just a few more moments to introduce Stephanie Masta to you all and why she is the person we should all take the time to listen to today as our least distinguished lecturer. All of us here are either educators or students or related to being in the classroom in some way. We spend a great deal of our time in classrooms. And so while we're at a research conference and we get to proofread our research papers and grants and presentations and get to put our most curated best foot forward when it comes to research, I personally have always believed that we are most ourselves in the classroom, especially when the classes run 3 hours into the night straight through dinner time, which is where I got to know Stephanie in my multiple qualitative methods courses at Purdue, now about a decade ago. We're all getting very old. Some of you, the few of you who know me in the audience, might have heard me say things like, my qualitative methods professor in grad school would say, you really have to show up as a human being yourself for your participants to show up as human beings. Or, if you're truly lucky, there are stories that your participants might share with you that they don't want to be shared further. Or other wisdom like, I was running yesterday listening to music, and I realized that qualitative research is like that Jack Johnson song. No, not banana pancakes. Never know, since the truth is all we got is questions. All right, one last quote, and I promise this is a real good one as well. When I get a request to do a research survey or an interview, I mostly do it because I believe in research karma. What goes around comes around. Stephanie, I'm certain countless research studies have benefited from this advice. Since now I, like perhaps all your past and current students, get a request for data collection, I'm like, fine. Stephanie said research karma is real, so I will take your survey and enter myself in this $5 Amazon gift card. Stephanie has worked with a generation of engineers like myself who used to think that we can pull ourselves by our bootstraps, metaphorical, whatever they mean, don't know. And that people we work with are our subjects. And that we are somehow intellectually superior than others because we can do advanced math. I know, we were so silly. And transformed us to people who have begun to understand systemic inequities, recognize the gift that is qualitative research and our participants and co-researchers' time and attention. And hopefully think that superiority only breeds hatred and discontent, whether that be based on knowing more math or having read a few more books and know words like hegemony and praxis. I know what this room is. And perhaps the most important thing, she doesn't do this by shaming you. She makes discomfort expected, authenticity valued, and changing your minds and opening your hearts possible. So much so that the worst thing about those 3-hour evening classes was that they were 3-hour evening classes. Even when inside the classrooms, our brains and hearts were experiencing deep dissonance, our long-held ideas of merit and entitlement were being shattered, and we were learning that doing qualitative research might actually be as much, if not more work, than running supersonic fluid dynamics tunnel experiments for a PhD. I was an aeroastro major. And so I have no doubt that what she will share with us today will be some of the most critical, thought-provoking, disruptive of ideas. But I would also request you to pay attention to how she does it. She doesn't think that you're silly or that you don't belong or judge you by your citation count or even how critical or provocative your last piece of writing has been. She exemplifies how to engage with humans as humans, how to name our tensions, sit with them, talk about them, and enact our values. As I wrap up my introduction, I would like to give a quick thank you to my roommate and friend Hector Rodriguez, who helped me finalize what I wanted to say today, and invite Dr. Stephanie Masta to deliver the 2026 Liberal Engineering and Society Division Distinguished Lecture. Thank you, Stephanie.
I mean, she covered it, so enjoy the rest of your afternoon. I'm kidding. So thank you to LEES for the invitation, also to ECSJ for the equity, for co-sponsoring, and really thank you for the lovely academic introduction. The academic introduction, so those of you that know me, or maybe will get to know me, I don't really always know why I'm an academic because I hate very much most of the practice of being an academic, particularly the writing piece. But one of my great joys as a professor is the academic introduction, mostly because it makes me sound like I know what I'm doing. And I had forgotten that you had taken class almost a decade ago because it seems that the years kind of blend together. So thank you very much. So as some of you may know, right, I consider myself pretty much like engineering adjacent. Because the engineering education space is not my main academic home, which gives me some latitude here in how I engage with its disciplinary expectations. In fact, I was talking with one of the PhD students I have the honor of working with, Austin, the other day about why am I so hard on engineering education? And I think part of it is because I'm really hard on education in general. And so I think that engineering education is the next space where some kind of critical things need to be uncovered and talked about. And so one of the disciplinary expectations that I find myself mildly frustrated by, particularly with engineers, and again, I have many grad students in this, or former grad students, and one of the things that in teaching engineering education students and engineers, and actually anybody in STEM about qualitative research, is really kind of the move that many folks make to action, right? The emphasis is on action when perhaps the emphasis on reflection would be a better choice. So nothing I'm gonna talk about today is about fixing anything. Spoiler alert. And if you've heard me speak before, you know that I'm not a checklist person. I'm not an action item person, and I'm not going to provide you with any type of roadmap on how to decolonize, how to be anti-racist, how to push back against the status quo, although I do sometimes have some ideas for that, so I'm happy to talk about them later. Instead, what I want to ask is whether or not what we're doing can even be fixed. So a little bit, I'm gonna deviate here for a second. So at Purdue, I was hired in 2014, and I was hired as qualitative methodologist. And I was hired, and they knew the work that I did, right? So I've actually never felt any type of pressure to do any type of non-critical work, because that's what I was hired to do. So it worked out in many ways. But for some perspective, there are 4 tenure track Native faculty on campus. There's about 1,800 of us, and I'm the only one that identifies as a woman. So I think about that a lot when I'm in these spaces, but that's also like why I fundamentally do not believe that where we're currently situated can actually be fixed, right? It's going to require an entirely new reimagination. And Purdue wisely promoted me to full professor last year, mostly I think to like never actually have to like, and one of the things my colleague said was he was like, I just can't wait for like what full professor Stephanie has to say. And I said, well, here's the thing. I said, I've been saying full professor stuff since the day I started, right? Because somebody gave me a piece of advice, and I've shared this with many of you, where they said, if you wait until you have tenure to speak your truth, you will forget what that truth is, right? And so the biggest accomplishment I have, outside of the lovely things that Avneet said about the way that I work with graduate students, and I actually do consider that my biggest legacy, and that's the legacy I want to leave, is that graduate students who worked with me felt supported, felt valued, felt that they could do the work that they wanted to do, is that I became a full professor, never having to compromise the things I believed in, or my values, or my work, or my research. And so it can be done. So some of you also might not know this about me, but I have a very healthy dislike of metaphor. And especially the type of metaphor we find in academia. Metaphors tend to both oversimplify and romanticize complex issues so that we're left with platitudes that do not allow us deeper engagement with a topic at hand. However, when I think about colonialism and how colonialism is embedded in academic disciplines such as engineering education, all of them, I liken the colonial process to a maze, right? It's winding, it's self-reinforcing, and it's designed to make you feel like you're moving forward or making progress when you're not. Raise your hand if you've ever been in a corn maze and just cut through the corn to get out. Okay, I need more of you to go to corn mazes, right? Spend some time in the Midwest. The corn maze is a healthy weekend activity, right? So for today, I want us to think about that the maze is kind of the structure, right, of colonial power, and the sense of forward motion or moving through the maze is the idea of good intention. So today I'm drawing on my 3 bodies of scholarship, right, which really kind of focus on coloniality in education, decolonial thought in engineering education, and the contributions of Indigenous scholars to professional organizations, particularly ASEE. So that's actually, I'm writing it up right now, hence the not liking to write thing. I think many of us feel that way. But yeah, so I had a grant from the Sloan Foundation to study Indigenous contributions to both ASEE and then my primary academic home, which is the American Education Research Association, so AERA. And so I see my work and the work of other scholars in these spaces as acts of resistance, not merely scholarship. The language of my work does something, right? It disrupts, it refuses, and it sometimes refuses again. So now I moved. Oh, yes, okay, I looked at the wrong slide, right? You know, you'd think like for somebody who's like been around technology for half of my life, I'd be like, wait, we're on the wrong slide. I should be looking at that slide. Anyways, this is why I don't do slides in my classes. So the question I want to ask you, right, is like, what is your language, doing in your scholarship? And as you think about this question, and sorry to disappoint you, but there will be no conversing with people at your tables during this talk, right? I respect folks who do that, and I recognize pedagogically why we do that, but I'll tell you what, I'm kind of contrarian. I'm like, if I paid this money to come to this conference, I just want to absorb. I just want you to talk at me, which I know is like not pedagogically what we're supposed to do, but in this case, I'm actually just going to talk at you. Well, with you, but at you. And so I want to be, so as you think about this question, right, I want to be honest that this is not a question that I can ask you from the outside. When I ask what your language is doing, I'm asking the question that I've had to keep asking of my own work. 10 years ago, I wrote a piece called Disrupting Colonial Narratives in the Curriculum. And I want you to notice the verb, right? The verb is intentional, not examining, not describing, but disrupting. I was already insisting back then that the words we put on a page don't sit still. That to write is to reach into the world and move something or to hold something in place. That conviction hasn't shifted in the decades since. If anything, it has hardened. Everything I've written since has been a variation of one claim, that narrative is not the wrapping around the work, it is the work. That to describe is to already decide. So I'm not bringing you something new today. I'm following a line I've been walking for a long time to the place that's finally brought me. And that place that has brought me is one of discomfort. And I love that you pointed that out, because discomfort is something that I think, right, so many of us might be familiar with Vygotsky, right, zonal proximal development, the one thing I remember from my ed psych class. But discomfort isn't a place we like to hang out in, right? And so as I think about my career and as I think about what I've done and as I think about where I want my work to go, really it has brought me to this place of discomfort. Because once you accept that language acts, right, that it disrupts, refuses, builds, erases, you can't stop the question at the language. Like, you have to start asking about the thing that the language is describing, right? And for me, that meant I had to start interrogating all of it, particularly the research process itself, right? And my current interrogation has led me to what I consider to be probably the next big question I want to answer, or the next big question I want to think about, because I don't think that there truly is an answer, which is, can any research ever be ethical in a colonial system? No. There's no ethical research under a colonial system. So I want to talk a little bit about this claim that will sound maybe to some of you like an overstatement, right? So engineering education functions as a salient arm of hegemonic domination. I want you to hold that for a second. Sit with how strange it sounds to say this about a field that thinks of itself as one of the most neutral disciplines that exists, right? Engineers don't take sides. Engineers solve problems, right? In engineering, the data speaks for itself. The bridge either stands or it doesn't, right? These are all things I've heard. But here's the claim underneath the claim, and it's the thing I want you to kind of like hold on to today, is that this domination does not happen in spite of engineering's neutrality, it happens through it. Neutrality is not the absence of a position, it is the position that has been allowed to stop announcing itself. Neutrality is the method, and objectivity is the cover story that the method tells about itself. I joke often that when I teach qualitative research, I need to wear a shirt that says, like, it depends, because it does. And then also, there's no objectivity, right? And for many, many students, it's really hard. In fact, like, despite me saying day one, there's no such thing as objective research. Week two, there's no such thing as objective research. Each week I will get questions where folks say, how do I be more objective in my research, right? So I want you to listen to the vocabulary for a second, because the vocabulary is the method showing its hand, right? We know these words: rigorous, objective, merit, My personal favorite, best practices. Every one of those words performs the same move. It points away from the entity that chose the question, chose the measure, chose what counts as a solution, and what counts as noise, right? It relocates the authority to into something that sounds like it has no author, right? There is a reason why in qualitative research we use first-person language, right? It's the ownership of what it is that we're doing. We selected on merit presupposes a measuring stick, and that stick was built by someone, somewhere, for some purpose, on someone's land. Neutrality is the name we give a position once we have forgotten that it was chosen. So when I say that research itself might not be ethical, I'm not talking about fraud or sloppiness or bad actors. I am talking about careful, rigorous, honest work done well by the rules, whose rules were colonial before any of us even existed, right? Side note, I do sit on our university's institutional review board, and so I have lots of very fascinating conversations about what counts truly as research ethics, and let's just say we disagree sometimes. To see that, right, to kind of see these colonial rules, you have to kind of go back to where the rules started to become written. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Erie Canal. Apropos, because I have a 15-year-old who's in Buffalo right now on a swimming training trip. And as a side note, so she's like the quintessential like child of an academic, and that she does not care a single iota about what I do. And when she asked, because I chatted with her, and she's like, "Why are you in Charlotte again?" And I said, "Oh, I'm giving this I'm giving this talk, And she's like, "What's a talk?" I said, "Well, it's kind of like a speech." And she goes, "Oh, well, in my speech class," she took speech this summer. She goes, "In my speech class, I gave a speech every other day." She said, "You just have to give one." And I said, "That's very fair, right? That is very, very fair. That is very fair." So in 1825, the United States completed the Erie Canal, right? 363 miles, Albany to Buffalo. It cut the cost of moving freight between the western farmlands and New York City by roughly 95%. It is, in so many ways, right, kind of the founding triumph of the engineering enterprise, proof that ingenuity plus will could remake a continent, and we talk about it this way, right? I'm not discrediting the importance of the Erie Canal. But here's what we often don't talk about, right? What it leaves out. That the canal was cut directly through the ancestral lands of all 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, right? So 30 years before that opened, in 1794, the United States had signed the Treaty of Canandaigua, which was George Washington's own government at the time, promising that it would never claim that land or disturb the people on it. If any of you have had a chance to go to the Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian, I don't know what it looks like currently, but when I was there a couple years ago, probably one of the most powerful pieces of the exhibit is the list of treaties that the United States government broke with the sovereign nations of this land. So the promise of peace, right, and the promise of sovereignty was what this treaty was supposed to protect. And within a generation, that promise was gone. The land was taken through a chain of treaties that violated even the federal government's own law at the time. And in 1823, 2 years before the canal was opened, the Supreme Court handed down the decision that wrote the doctrine of discovery into American property law, which is the principle that to improve land is to earn the right to take it. And I want to hold these 2 events in one frame, right? The legal doctrine that improvement justifies dispossession, and the engineering monument to improvement. Built at the same moment, on the same ground, in service of the same logic. Extraction as improvement is not a stain on engineering's origin story, it is the origin story, right? Engineers solve problems. Engineers make things better. And it runs deeper than the land. To the Haudenosaunee, water is a living relative. The canal required you first to believe that water is a channel, right? That water, a thing for moving goods, right? that it performs labor for you. That conversion from relative to resource is what engineering sometimes calls a design assumption. It is the method doing exactly what it was built to do and calling the result neutral. If neutrality is the method, then the next question is how it stays invisible, because a method that announced itself could be argued with. The answer is, of course, whiteness. So I'm just putting that out there. Working as the unmarked default. And I want to be precise about unmarked because it isn't an insult, it's a structural position. And so when I think back to my quantitative days, because I did start as a quantitative person, no shame to the quantitative people in the room. But when we think about, when I think about like when we're setting up right data sets, when we're setting up our spreadsheets of our variables and all that good stuff. And so the moment that you have race as a variable in the model, someone becomes the reference category, right? And so the baseline that everyone else is measured against, and what has historically happened in educational research is white is that baseline model. The finding never comes out as white students perform this way. It's always, brown and black students, perform against white students in this way. And so white isn't in the results because white is the axis the results are plotted on. And the convention that feels like neutral statistical practice has already decided who is the standard, who is the deviation before a single number is run. That is whiteness as the unmarked default written into the method at the level of a coding choice. And for many of you, this isn't new, right? You're all like, you're nodding. You're like, yeah, I get that. However, once you see it there, I want you to start seeing it everywhere. The generic student in the pedagogy paper who has no race does have a race. It's typically white. We talk about the achievement gap, right, which locates the deficit in the marked student and never in the system doing the measuring. Gloria Ladson-Billings did a wonderful address at AERA, I think 2006, called Educational Debt, which I think is actually a really helpful reframe for those of you that are interested in that. The fact that a black scholar's work often gets filed under race in engineering education, while white scholars' identical methods work is filed just under engineering education. Not to mention the way that white scholars in all fields are often over-rewarded for doing work in diversity spaces. And folks like myself often receive very underhanded questions about, do I really think I can be a good researcher when I'm researching, so close to home? Also something that I was asked early in my career. One is treated as doing DEI. One is simply just doing the work of the field. Think about who in this room has ever been asked to defend their positionality when it comes to their research agenda. And notice who has never been asked once. So this is actually what James, Holly, and I talk about when we wrote our editorial about the critique of critical race theory and the way that it's used in engineering education. Not that it scolds, but that it hands you an instrument to kind of see the baseline as a baseline, right? It's meant to look at the structure, not the individual experience. In fact, the moves that most disciplines make to go to the individual are fascinating to me and also intentional, right? Because if the idea is that, the system feels overwhelming sometimes, but in reality, the individual, we have to change the system. And that, so until you, right, so because critical race theory hands us an instrument, right, to see the baseline as a baseline, to mark the unmarked. So until you can do that, you can't really give an honest account of anything. You can't audit a system whose 0 point is the one quantity no one is allowed to name. So several years ago at Purdue, they created an equity task force. I mean, we know where those task forces go. And when the equity task force, I was conveniently not asked to serve on the equity task force. I asked actually several times and was not happening. But when they did their first round of suggestions, I was gonna say revisions, suggestions, it was all things like more programming, increase retention, increase recruitment, right? And when I sat in the public listening session, I said, where's the recommendation about addressing white supremacy on campus? There was no recommendation. I felt a little bit, I felt for Renee, who was our director of diversity something at the time, and she was like, why there's no recommendation. I'm like, I know, I just had to say it. So in front of me is a room full of careful, decent, wonderful people who hear this critique, right? You hear it. I know you wouldn't be here if you didn't hear it. But here's also kind of the crucial move, is that many of you don't necessarily reject it, right? Engineering education doesn't necessarily quite reject whiteness, right? Rejection would be easy to fight. What the system does instead, and this is what I want you to kind of hold on to, is it absorbs it, right? The engineering does not say, the institution does not say, engineering is not colonial, right? It says, yes, it is. I mean, many of us in this room will say, yes, engineering is colonial. And here, once I acknowledge, yes, it is colonial, here's our decolonization working group. Here's the land acknowledgement we now read before events. Here are 3 indigenous case studies we folded into the curriculum. Here is the word decolonial in the keywords of our latest paper. The yes that we say in that moment is not a surrender. The yes is the neutralization. A system that says no and changes nothing is very brittle. You can point to the no, right? A system that says yes and changes nothing is almost indestructible, because it has enlisted the critique of proof of its own virtue. We acknowledge it, therefore we are good, and then we don't have to do anything else, right? Let me repeat this. A system that says yes and then changes nothing is almost indestructible, because it has enlisted the critique as a proof of its own virtue. This is what I and a couple of my co-authors named when we described efforts that alter colonizing practices while leaving space to develop new colonizing practices, right? We've done a couple pieces around decolonization in engineering. The critique gets metabolized, it gets taken in, it gets broken down, and excreted as a committee, a statement, a reading list. And each of those things are good on their own terms, right? None of them often touches who owns the knowledge, who funds it, or whose land is on building on, right? Tuck and Yang gave this its name more than a decade ago, before most of us were ready to hear it, which is that decolonization is not a metaphor, is not inclusion, is not diversity, is not a more thoughtful syllabus, is about the land, is about the return of the land, is meant to be incommensurable with our comfort. The substitutes, they said, are settler moves to innocence, the gestures that let you feel resolved without giving anything up. So let me hand you a diagnostic, and I'll be blunt. If you believe that your decolonization work feels good, if it feels finishable, if it ends in a sense of progress and a clean conscience, then that is the tell. A genuine decolonial demand is unsettling by design. It costs whoever holds the power something real. The moment it stops costing you anything and starts feeling like an accomplishment, it has been domesticated. That is not the system failing to decolonize, that is the system doing exactly what it is built to do with a threat. Keep the form, drop the substance, and let's call it progress. Which leaves 2 types of questions on the table, right? And they're not the same size. And I'll talk about this in a minute. So for example, the comfortable question, right, is how do I maybe decolonize my syllabus? I will say that, in many ways, decolonize has become like what Michael Apple called an equity. Basically, he talked about how like diversity and equity became like a slogan, right? And in many ways, like decolonization is a slogan now, because in fact, there was maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, I got some email that said like, decolonize your budget, and I'm like, okay. I don't know what that means, but sure. So the comfortable question is like, how might I decolonize my syllabus, right? The uncomfortable, harder question is maybe what am I reproducing every single time that I teach? So when you design your next project, your next work, kind of sit with these ideas of questions, right? Not rhetorically, but actually answer them. Who benefits from the knowledge you produce? Who owns it? Who funded it? And whose land is your institution sitting on right now while you do the work? I want to be careful here because none of this requires villains, okay? There's no one in this room who designed this. The people who build and defend the system are, almost without exception, well-meaning, competent, careful, doing good work by every standard the field gave them. This is not an exception to the problem, that is the problem. A wall you can see and refuse and climb. This is the maze, right? A maze runs on careful people following the path in front of them. That is what makes it so hard to leave. So if the structure itself is colonial, and this is the argument I'm making and kind of will continue to make, then really the only honest place to look next is not the curriculum, but it's really in the relationship, right? So like, what do we owe and to whom? What are our obligations to each other? So what do we owe, right? So several years ago, I gave a talk to, so I wrote an autoethnography, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, and a friend of mine was teaching a class on autoethnography, and they were all first-year students, and so she asked me to give a talk about the autoethnography, so I did. And she had said that I asked the students to write questions, would you like to see them advance? And I said no, which now I realize I probably should have said yes, because some of those questions were difficult. But I had said no. And one of the questions a student asked me, and I have talked about this before, was he said, you know, all of your work is very critical of your work, right? So how do you reconcile having these values and these beliefs and working in a highly colonial institution? And I say, I don't reconcile, right? Every day is the tension. Some days the tension is harder than others. Some days it feels more of a burden than less of a burden, but the tension is always there, and the tension will always be there, right? There's never going to be resolution while I continue to work at Purdue University. There would never be resolution if I went to go work at Haskell, right? Because like colonialism is everywhere, right? It's like the air. So what do we owe, right? So I want to kind of go back to the choice a number of Indigenous scholars made, and that I have made too, which is the choice to participate in places like ASEE et al. To take Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous grief, Indigenous refusal, and to set it down inside the proceedings of a field that, for most of its history, really didn't have place for us. Our decision to write in this space, and our decision to write for other professional organizations, such as AERA, was a decision about who we were trying to reach and what it would cost to reach them. We were writing into a room that had erased us in the hope that being in the room might be worth the erasure it asked us to survive. And so here's one of the things I can't quite get out from under. When I did that, right? So when I do this, when I carry a community's words into a colonial institution, like what did I owe that community? And if anything, like what did the community owe me? Because the comfortable story is that research is a transaction, right? I come, I collect, I leave, I publish, everyone is cited. IRB is satisfied, no one is harmed. That story depends on a belief that I want to name and reject, that a method is a tool, that is neutral, that an interview, a survey, an ethnographic field note is just an instrument you pick up, use correctly, and set down, and that using it correctly is the whole of its ethics. A method is not a tool, a method is a relationship. Research methodology re-emphasizes societal values and reproduces systems of power. It's never just gathering. Every method carries a theory of who gets to know and who gets to be known, who asks and who answers, who keeps the recording, and who merely appears in it. So the question is not whether or not your methods are clean. I'm sure all of you do amazing good research. The question is what relationship they put you in. Oh, sorry. At least it's not like attached to me, because then it would be all over. So the question is what relationship they put you in. When you study people, study with people, work with people, you're not holding an instrument, you are standing in relationship with them. I'm talking to most of you because I'm assuming that most of your empirical work is with other humans. I will say that I believe this firmly for my colleagues who do work with animals, with plants, with other living relations, okay? So I just want to make real clear here that we are always in relationship to the topics we study, whether it be a rock, whether it be apple trees, whether it be sandalwood, whether it's faculty on our campus, okay? You are standing in relationship with them, whether you have admitted it or not, whether you have honored it or not. So what relationship are you in with the people you study? I was set a set of obligations long before I was ever taught a methodology. So I'm from Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, which is way up there in the Upper Peninsula, and both Canada and the US. And so the Anishinaabe carry teachings that we refer to as the 7 grandfathers, right? So wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. I just listed that as a list. I want to be a little careful there because the moment that I do list them like that in a keynote on a slide, they start to sound like a value statement, like something that you could just like drop somewhere, like here are my values. And that's really kind of not exactly what they are. I mean, it's a much bigger embodiment of these in practice. So these aren't principles that I apply to my research. They are the relationships I am already inside that make demands on me whether or not it was convenient. Respect is not a tone I adopt in my methods section. It's an obligation that decides what I'm allowed to ask and what I must leave alone. Truth is not a finding. It is something I owe to the people who let me into their lives, which sometimes means the truest thing I can do with a story is not tell it. Humility is not a limitations paragraph. It is knowing the community understood all of this before I arrived and will understand it long after I'm gone. When these are taken seriously, they do not decorate a method, they become the method. Storytelling becomes the method. Community engagement becomes the method. Relationality becomes the method. Giving back becomes the method. Not the throwaway thing you add at the end so the project looks reciprocal, but the obligation the whole thing answers to from the first day. The giving back is not the afterword, it is the reason. Which brings me to a word I want to offer you, and is not a comfortable one: refusal. The anthropologist Audra Simpson writes about ethnographic refusal, the researcher who declines to tell everything that could be told, not because the data is thin, but because some things, when told, would serve the institution and betray the community. Refusal is the recognition that being legible to your field is not the same as being accountable to your people, or your plants, or your trees, or your animals. And that when those two pull apart, the colonial institution will always, always reward the legibility. This is the part that costs something. Everything in the academy trains you to tell, to disclose, to publish, to make findings, to be transparent. I cannot begin to count the number of times I have been encouraged to turn my mentorship of brown and black graduate students into a research project. You should study this. You should write about it. You should take notes on it. No. These are virtues, real ones, and they are also the exact mechanism by which a community's knowledge is extracted and made to circulate without it. Refusal says, I know something and I'm not going to give it to you. And the institution hears that as failure, as missing data, as me not doing my job. So what does refusal mean when you're inside a colonial institution? When the very thing you are refusing is the thing the institution most wants from you and most rewards you for handing over? I'm not going to answer that, so don't ask me about it in the Q&A. Instead, I want to put the question underneath it to all of you, and I want to leave it here in this room, and I don't even want you to necessarily think about answering, I just want you to sit with it, which is when you conduct research, when you design the study, when you write the consent form, when you decide what goes in the paper and who stays out, Who are you obligated to? Are you obligated to your institution, who employs you and counts your output? To your field, who reviews you and decides whether you belong? To your participants, who gave you the thing that you built your career on? Future generations, who can inherit whatever you make normal? Your own community, the one you may have had to leave to get into this room in the first place? You'll notice I have not told you how to rank those. I'm not going to. Anyone who tells you or gives you an answer to that is selling you something. And what they're usually selling is the permission to stop feeling the pull. The discomfort you are feeling right now, and some of you may be feeling a little bit of discomfort, is that those obligations do not often line up. And that honoring one can mean betraying another. And that is not a flaw in the question. That is the honesty of the question. And so I'm going to leave it unresolved because I think it needs to stay unresolved. And I'll only say one thing about where it goes next, right? An obligation you only talk about is not yet an obligation, right? It stays abstract, a feeling, a value, a line in a keynote. Right up until the moment it shows up in the form of the work itself, in what you actually wrote, and what you refused to write, and the shape of the thing you handed your field. So let's look at the form. When I say form of the work, when I say the form of the work was the argument, here's what I mean, concretely from some of the work of our Indigenous scholars at ASCE, right? So one scholar put the Cherokee syllabary, which is, for folks who don't know what syllabary is, it's like a list of syllables, for kind of like a vocab page, essentially, and left it untranslated. If you could read it, it was for you. If you couldn't, that was the point, right? You were being shown in the middle of an engineering paper that this knowledge was not built for your access. The refusal was not in the argument, right? The refusal was in the presentation. And I think about this a lot when we read and we have participants who share with us in their primary language, and the expectation that the translation has to occur, as opposed to just being, if you can't read this, then maybe it's not for you to have, right? Another structure of the paper is a spiral instead of a march you've been trained to expect, right? The introduction, the literature review, methods, finding, conclusion. I will say that is one of my favorite things about teaching qualitative research to new folks, is that they're like, I'm sorry, what do you mean you can just name the sections whatever you want? And I'm like, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Sometimes a little confusing, but beautiful. It's a straight line, right, from question to answer, right? A spiral doesn't resolve. It returns, and each return is deeper. That is not a failure to organize. That is a different theory of how knowledge moves, enacted in the shape of a paper rather than asserted in its abstract. I am always really surprised about the fact that we sometimes forget that we make the academy. Right? When I was up for promotion and tenure, when I was going from assistant to associate, I had these lovely colleagues who would stop me in the hallway. That's when I learned when you're in that year, you should just stop going in, because people say things like this to you in the hallway, where they would say, really hope it works out for you. And I wanted to say, well, you decide. You literally decide if it works out for me. So if you hope it works out, you have some power here, right? And I think about this a lot when we talk about wanting a field to be critical, and then forget that we're the ones who are reviewing the papers. I was in a session yesterday where, and a young scholar raised a really important point, which was, sometimes I have to think about where I want to publish this, right? Because, my engineering journals might not accept this work. And I wanted to raise my hand and say, I see 3 JE editors right here. Why don't you ask them, right? Again, we make the field, right? So in the last 2 examples, right, that I just shared, the choice of language and the choice of shape did the work the explicit argument could not, right? The form was the argument, the form did the refusing. And so now I want to turn this back to me, because I don't get to admire this from a safe distance either. I've tried to do the same thing with my own work, and I want to kind of talk a little bit about where, so this stays a little bit honest. So when I wrote about the 7 grandfathers, so I wrote this autoethnography, and if anybody's ever done autoethnographic work, you know it's very, very hard. Because you have to kind of critically think about yourself and your experiences, and that can raise a whole sorts of questions. And in fact, the feedback I received on this I don't really ever remember like the reviewer feedback very well, but I remember this specifically because the editor said, for an autoethnography, you're missing quite a bit. Me meaning me, right? And so when I wrote about this work, and this work kind of came from some tension. So, like many indigenous folks in the United States, my family has a long history of healthy distrust and well-placed distrust of the current educational system. And so my decision to pursue higher education was not maybe necessarily met with the same type of reception that other young people receive when they decide to do that. So there's a lot of family work that had to take place. And so in many ways, writing this was an opportunity for me to kind of work through that a little bit in the way I knew how, which is through academic work, right? And so when I wrote this paper, so I didn't really write about the described indigenous methodology from the outside, right? I wrote it to kind of center my experience, and then I structured it around these teachings that had been so profound for me growing up. The teachings themselves were not my object, right, of study. They were the architecture of the writing. The method was not described. It was enacted, right? So if I had written a conventional paper about relational ethics, the form would have contradicted the content. I'd been making a colonial argument about a particularly decolonial idea. And so the only way to keep faith with the claim was to let it shape the container. When I wrote about the experiences of Native graduate students, I had a choice. Right? They talked a lot about being exhausted. And so I could have asserted the exhaustion, right? Stated in the abstract, defined it, cited it, and moved on. But I didn't do that. I kind of let it accumulate. Occurrence after occurrence after occurrence until the weight builds, until the form itself becomes tiring to move through. The exhaustion is not claimed in that paper. It is produced in you. Because the only honest way to convey a thing that is itself an accumulation, right? The form carries what the argument cannot. And when I wrote my first paper, first grown-up paper after, which was on my dissertation. So my dissertation, I worked with a group of 8th grade middle school students at a predominantly white school. Their parents chose to put them in the predominantly white school instead of the tribal school. And I learned a lot about what good research is and is not through that process. And so when I talked about their experiences navigating school, I kind of refused at the time, and again, I was writing this in 2012, 2013, I refused the reading of the field was waiting for. And so the field often looks for Native students to be code switchers. They talk about code switching a lot, right? Folks who move between this place of, they talk about accommodation as opposed to assimilation, even though they're kind of the same thing. They expected me to talk about assimilation, withdrawal, problems to fix. But I named accommodation as resistance. And not because I soften the facts, but because the deficit reading is itself a colonial act, and which frame you reach for is never neutral. We still have a pretty deep deficit perspective in a lot of our fields. We don't think it's a deficit perspective, grit, growth mindset, all those sorts of things, deficit perspectives. And so I want us to think about that. The interpretation, so the frames you reach for are never neutral. The interpretation was the politics. The choice of the frame did the refusing. So what does your methodology reveal about what you actually value, not what you say you value, right? This is why I tell folks I never need a diversity statement. Because if you're truly committed to doing this work, it will show up everywhere. Your method section is a confession, whether you intend it or not. What you measured, what you left out, who you let speak, and who you spoke for, and what you called data, and what you called noise, what you took, and what you gave back. That is the real value statement. Not in the one positionality statement, not in the one reflexivity paragraph, It's in the design. And I want to close this part of the talk kind of by closing the exit, because it's an easy way out of this room and I don't want to leave it open. And so the easy answer is to say, my research embodies good values, good rigor, transparency, the welfare of my participants. Those aren't bad words, but sit with them 1 second longer than is comfortable. Who defined rigor? And what knowledge did that definition rule out before you even began? Whose transparency? Transparency to the institution or accountable to the community? Because we've already seen that those are not the same thing. And the welfare of your participants. For how long? Through data collection or after the paper is published? The grant is closed and the line is on your CV. Are they still living in the same experiences of your study described? And have you moved on from them? There's no research outside the social relations of power. None. Even with the trees, even with the plants, even with the rocks, even with materials engineering, which I'm learning a lot about. None. So the question was never whether your research embodies values. It does. It always does. The only question is which ones and whether you are willing to look. So when I think about what the unsolvable unanswered questions from this talk are, I put a lot of questions before you. Notice you're not going to get a full slide of all the questions. I want to end with this claim. Epistemological, oh my gosh, right? I want to say epistemic. Side note, even though I teach this, epistemology and ontology, every week I have to relook them up. For whatever reason, my brain does not want to, my brain can hold on to lots of things, but it doesn't want to hold on to this, which I probably should do a little deeper reflection on, but not today. Epistemological decolonization can never be prescribed nor systematic within our current academic institutions. Sit with what I'm refusing to give you here, right? No rubric, no best practice, no checklist, no conference panel that once you've sat on it makes you one of the good ones. And I know that's not what a talk like this is supposed to do, right? A talk like this is supposed to end with a slide, the one with the 5 action items, the one you photograph on your way out, so you can feel that the hour was useful. And I'm not going to give you that slide. And I want to be clear that withholding it is not a stylistic choice. It's the whole argument, okay? So think about what the scholars I've leaned on during this talk actually did. They could have written recommendations. They could have had the standing to, right? Instead, they did something harder. They surfaced the language, that they named the systems, they centered the people the systems were built to push the edges, and then they stopped. They left the reader standing in the middle of it with no map. The absence is not a gap in the work. That absence is the work. A map would have told you that the maze has a solution. And in case you're curious, all corn mazes do have a solution. They're not always easy, but they have a solution. The map would have told you that the maze has a solution. It doesn't. The honest thing, and really the only honest thing, was to refuse to draw a map. And here's where it turns, because language was never safe, right? So we've spent this hour, this time, treating naming as the first act of resistance, right? Say the system's name, and you've begun to loosen its hold. But the system knows that too. The very same structures that resist being decolonized are, right now, moving to ban the words we'd use to name them, right? The system is sneaky and always a little bit ahead, but there's a reason. The terms, the frameworks, the reading list, outlawed in some places by statute, and I think many of us have been affected by this, right? So understand what the maze actually is. It's not a wall standing still while you look for the gap. It is a wall that rebuilds itself the moment you describe it. Name the exit, and the maze moves the exit. That's not paranoia. That is the documented behavior of the thing. Which brings me back to the idea of good intentions. I've not been standing up here to tell you that your intentions are the enemy. They aren't. Most of you came into this work because you meant something good by it, and you still do, right? I want to be real clear here. I know all of you are doing really, really good work, right? The problem was never the intention. The problem is that good intentions are the place where we stop. They often become a resting point we arrive at. Well, I meant well. I set the bag down and we breathe. And while we're resting there, satisfied, the structure goes right on doing the thing it was built to do. The meaning well doesn't interrupt it. The meaning well was never going to interrupt it. So I don't want to leave here feeling guilty. Well, I don't feel guilty. I don't want you to feel guilty. Because honestly, guilt is just another resting point. It feels like motion, and it costs us nothing. And I think many of us in this room have probably had to manage the guilt of some colleagues before, and it's exhausting. And so I want something narrower and harder than guilt. Okay? I want you to leave here clear. Clear about what the work actually does, regardless of what you meant by it. Clear about what you owe and to whom when the meaning well runs out. So, final last question. And I'm not going to answer it. And I don't want you to necessarily answer it either. If the system cannot be made ethical, and I hope I have not given you any reason to believe it can be, then what are we still doing inside of it? And whatever your answer to that is, what does it obligate you to do next? Thank you.